In this video, I'm going to show you how I built the doors for my new shed. Now, in thinking about what kind of doors I wanted, it became pretty clear I wasn't going to be able to just buy some doors. I was going to need to build my own because I've got a few special requirements that I'll get into here in just a little bit. So I started with bringing in all the materials that I was going to need and then taking all of the measurements to figure out exactly what dimensions I needed to have these doors be set to. Now, before I get into the actual building, let's clean up here just a little bit. All right, so here's kind of my plan for the doors. You can see the opening is exactly 64 inches wide. And I wanted to make sure that the doors look like they're exactly the same width. So the trim is going to be 31 3/4 inches wide on both sides, which will leave me room for a few gaps, about 1/4 inch or so all the way around. The problem though is I don't want to be able to see through that gap in the middle of the doors when you're standing in front of the shed. So I've got this little offset part here where the trim is going to overlap the back part of the door. And so one door is going to be wider than the other at 30.5 and the other one is going to be at 33 inches. So one door is going to be the one that closes against the other door. I hope all of that makes sense. It'll make more sense the farther on we go. So after I had all my wood cut up, it was time to start assembling the frames. These doors are going to be kind of an Oreo of a bunch of different layers of things, and the frame is where I was going to start. Now, when it came time to decide how to attach the frames, I wasn't too sure the best way to go about doing it. I actually started with pocket screws on the first set of doors, and I didn't really like the outcome. They were strong-ish, but they weren't as strong as I wanted. So I opted for this, just putting a 3-inch screw in, and it was a little stronger. End grain's not the best way to attach pieces of wood together, but since this is going to be sandwiched with other materials, this was good enough. In order to make sure the door stayed perfectly square, I also wanted to put in some diagonal support. So you can see here I went ahead and drilled pilot holes at both end locations, and then I attached one end of the diagonal, but not the other end yet because I still have to square the door. So to square the door, you just grab a tape measure and measure diagonally across it and then switch and measure on the other diagonal. And if the measurements are exactly the same, then your door is square and you don't have to do what I'm about to have to do, which is to adjust that door. Now, this is a pretty tall door. I didn't have any clamps big enough to reach, so what I did is I took these pipe clamps and I rotated their ends. So one was pointed 90 degrees off from the other one. This way, when I laid it on the door, the one at one end is going to point straight down and hook over that corner like that, and the other one's going to face right towards the camera there. Then when I attach the other one, lay that on the door, and we're going to have the same thing where one tab's pointing back towards me and the other tab's pointing straight down. So you can see here then the tabs hook onto each other, and you can clamp the clamps to each other and use that to square up the door. Now, as I recall, this particular door was only out by about 3/4 of an inch, so it didn't take much to adjust it. And then we just put that diagonal in there the right way, and we were finished. I did do a couple of different diagonal patterns since I was building 4 doors. I got to experiment a little bit. So this is the second door for this end of the shed, and we just went with a different pattern. It was a little easier to square up when we were done. Once the frames were finished, I decided to try and fit them into the opening to make sure that we had our measurements all correct, and it looks like, yep, they look good to me. All right, so now it's time to start putting on the facing, or I guess the exterior part of the door. And this starts with some siding pieces that I cut to fit and put on to make it kind of look like some nice vertical slats. This was a nice look that I thought would match well with the rest of the house. So I put that on with some simple construction adhesive and some screws. And this is what that looks like when that first layer is completely on. There was a little bit of squeeze out to clean up, and once that was done, then it was time to start thinking about trim. Now, unfortunately, this siding material has this kind of weird profile where right at the edge here, the trim had this gap that was going to be really a problem because that trim wasn't going to lay flush against the door. So I had this little off-cut piece of scrap that I had from a previous piece of this siding, and turns out it's just exactly the right thickness. So I set that right there and was just testing here to see if this was going to hold that trim correctly, and it's perfect. So to make sure that's not going to go anywhere, out comes the brad nailer again, and got that all nailed together. And then I realized I had another problem. See, this is the frame with the skin on top, and the trim is going to go right on top of that, just like I just showed. Now the other door that's opposite is going to come and close, and its piece of trim is going to come down and hit the frame of the door like this, which is not what I want. I want it to stop even with the trim of the other door. So I need to get another spacer to fill in that gap a little bit to make it so that the doors, when they're closed, they're completely flush with each other. So luckily, I have some other pieces of this siding that were the cutoffs from when I cut them to fit the door, and I was able to cut that up into some shorter little pieces like this, just exactly the right size, and attach those in to make that offset work perfectly. Alright, with all of the siding attached to the door correctly, now it was time to install the trim around the door. And this was really easy, just again with the brad nailer and the construction adhesive. The only tricky part was to make sure that I had my offsets and overhangs exactly correct, as one door was going to overlap the other door. And so I needed on one to have an overlap and the other one to have it inset. So not all of the doors are exactly the same, but they more or less look just like this when you're looking at them from the outside. You can see all of the layers here. We've got the trim, and then the siding, and then the frame. So they're coming together pretty well, but they're not quite finished yet. I also wanted to add some OSB to the back side. This will help make the door that much more rigid and help prevent it from sagging any more than it might have. Even though it had that diagonal support already in there, it might have sagged a little bit. So again, with the construction adhesive and some screws and presto changeo rearrangeo, the door is finished with the major parts of the construction, and now I can move on to paint. So this started with caulking all of the little brad holes and filling all the gaps between pieces of trim, and then I could start to prep the hinges because I'm going to paint those to match as well. Now these hinges came with a little coating of oil or grease on them, so I'm using this Prep All cleaner to strip that off, and then I'm going to prime them with some simple spray primer. And once they're primed, then I'm going to paint them with the same color as the exterior of the rest of the shed. Now remember, safety first. Alright, so once I had them all cleaned up, it was time to prime them. And I was careful to make sure and spray them from all four sides, so I got all of the angles of the exposed metal. And this will help make sure that the paint adheres everywhere. And once the primer had dried, a quick spray coat of the exterior paint that I'm using on the shed is one of my accent colors, and the hinges are ready to go. So painting the doors was pretty much like painting the rest of the shed. If you missed my video on how I did that, you can click the link up above to check that out. It's a pretty simple process. Spray on the base coat and then roll on the accent colors. And before I knew it, it was time to hang these doors. Now this process starts with putting down some shims, and in this case I'm just using some off-cut pieces of siding. That'll make sure that the gap at the bottom of the door is just right so that the door won't bind or hit the concrete when it's swinging. And if my measurements are all correct, then this should slide right in and make a nice fit. So we got the door placed just about where it needed to be, and then used one of my big pipe clamps to hold it in the right spot so that we could check the clearances all the way around the door. Now, when you're hanging your doors, you may have to shim them a little bit, but what you're looking for is a consistent gap all the way around. And I'm using a paint stirrer stick here to make sure that the gap is even all the way from the top to the bottom of the door. And once I was real happy with it, it was time to put some hinges on there. Now hinges, I like to start with just one screw and then use that to hold the hinge in place to drill the rest of the pilot holes and put in the remaining screws. This process is what we repeated for all the hinges on all four doors. And before we knew it, we had some doors ready to go. So now I needed to think about how to lock these doors. So I got one of these kinds of locking bolts up at the top, marked around the location where I'd installed it in the frame of the door, and then checked to make sure that my location was correct, and then finished drilling the hole, and now it's a nice locked door. We also need a handle on the outside, and so we carefully measured and marked the hole for that. Put the handle through and got it screwed to the frame, and then had my son actually do the final last piece here of attaching the inside part, and now we've got a handle. So I'm really thrilled. It looks great. What do you think? Well, I'm kind of a pants and suspenders kind of guy, so I wanted to put one more locking mechanism on the bottom of that one side of the door that was going to stay closed most of the time. So again, just attach that to the door, and then once it was on, mark the location where it needs to go into the concrete, start a little bit of a hole, check to make sure my location's good, and then finish off the hole the rest of the way. And with that, the shed doors are finished. And by finishing the shed doors, I have finished the shed. I've learned so much while building this. I've really enjoyed the process, and I'm really looking forward to getting my garage cleaned out and reclaiming all of that space for more wood shop space instead. Hey, if you've been building a shed along with me, I'd love to hear how it's going for you. If you've learned a little something or been entertained at all by what you've seen in this series, let me know down in the comments. I'd sure love to hear from you. And as always, thank you very, very much for watching.